And that is it for today.
The main moral of that story is don't bring a rifle to a cannon fight.
Yeah.
Right?
I just realized I almost giggled. I thought it was really inappropriate. When Ebony died, the flag behind her says mort.
Oh,
It says what?
Mort,
Mort.
Latin for death.
Really? Wow.
It's like as they carried her body, it was like 2 seconds, and the flag said but mort. I was like, eh.
yeah, there are a few Easter eggs in there that I catch every time I'm watching it. So, obviously not the most encouraging, uplifting episode in this. You know, I want to say
I know.
Shortest revolution
Right.
ever.
I had asked earlier when we were getting started who had seen these before and who hadn't. And, you know, as I've been putting this together, this whole study and making it fit within 6 weeks of Lent, not only, you know, partly for biblical themes, partly for the musical themes in it, but also, you know, I've really tried to let the storytelling work by choosing how I would group the different scenes in this. And so kind of my hope is that for those who haven't seen it in particular, like if this were a version of Les Misérables, the musical, but it was being done as streaming services do today, you know, releasing it in like a 6 to 8 week episode special, that's what it's felt like, you know, that it's kind of stopped and started at appropriate places and giving you a chance to reflect and think and look forward to what we're doing next and wanting to hear the rest of the story and seeing where the story takes it. This part of this, I'm trying to get where I can have the chat up here. There we go. This, from here on out, these last 2 weeks, when I talk about the biblical themes within Les Misérables, we've touched on some good stuff in the previous 4 weeks, but a lot of that, like any story, has also been setting things up. This will get biblically significant this week and next in terms of how things play out on this. As far as some things about the musical that I wanted to point out for all of us, this section of it, you know, there's a long list of songs and they're kind of short songs, little sung through spots. There's really only what I would call like 2 radio play songs in here. Maybe you could throw a little Fall of Rain in there also. But basically, Do You Hear the People Sing and Bring Him Home are the 2 big songs in this part of the story. And last week I spent a chunk of time, because we were in One Day More, talking about leitmotifs and how melodic structure and words to create certain motifs. So, and I said last week, these were all the big ones, save maybe 1 or 2 more that will come. And so right out of the gate, one of the really, really substantial ones here on forward for these next 2, I don't want to blow anything, but basically bookending where we started today and where we'll end is the song, Do You Hear the People Sing? And it has incredible meaning by the end of the story. So yeah, last week was One Day More, and this week we're talking about when that day comes. And I broke it into 2 topics here. And the first I call To the Barricades. There was a plan here that was going to be a conflict that was coming. And so Ecclesiastes 3 verses 1 through 8 says, there's a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, and a time for war and a time for peace. And it's a well-known passage, but I chose it because I really want to carry over from last week's One Day More and talk about how that plays out in this part of the story. Before going there, the whole issue of conflict. So in the Bible, God both endorses and condemns war. And there hasn't been a generation that hasn't struggled to understand a biblical position on warfare. You know, how could that ever be just? And yet, in the face of injustice, how can it not be unjust to not go into battle for something that is just? And so it's always been a source of conflict. In the Old Testament, God sent his people into battle, even giving them detailed battle plans to follow. At other times, God has punished people who lived in violence, called out, through the prophets, called out Israel for their participation in violence. Christ calls us to live peacefully, but also to stand up for the truth and for the oppressed people. So what is the biblical answer to calls for war? And I kind of just throw that out there as a rhetorical question, not as one for us to discuss deeply. It's not my intent, and it's not the crux of what I want to go through today to try and answer that specifically. Just acknowledging that is a really difficult topic for followers of Christ, and that I would be careful. I think one of the things that I'd be careful about is to judge anyone who participates in warfare conflict as someone who is just if you're a pacifist, so to speak, to judge anyone who is in that sort of conflict as being someone who's outside of God's will. Similarly, the other way around, those who choose pacifism, and I want to say especially in our country, but I would say perhaps even more so in other countries where maybe they don't have the freedom to choose that, to regard them as a coward or unpatriotic, not fulfilling their duty if they have really in earnest, in faithfulness, determined that they are fulfilling their higher duty by responding to how they believe God leads them in the face of the question of warfare and conflict. I think it is one of many topics, obviously a huge one in which somewhere on the globe, we've never really ever faced peace worldwide, ever. And so there's a sense in which to follow Christ is to wrestle with this issue of war and conflict.
I struggle with the innocent people who get caught up in it and suffer because of it, especially when God sent his people to wipe out a nation. There had to be innocent people who didn't know God who were killed.
Yeah. I think that is, there is no, and I'm not saying this in a sense of cliche or trying to trivialize it. You don't just have combatants.
Right.
This isn't like knights facing each other in the field of battle. You don't have just combatants. I was just, can't remember why I was reading, but I was reading an article that was recapping the last Gulf War, and and trying to talk about whether or not it was worth it or not, and talking about, and I assure you, I'm not getting into a political comment. I'm making your point, and then it talked about the number of soldiers that we lost, and then by comparison, the number of civilians in Iraq that were killed. And then you throw into that all the complications of civilian combatants versus, what we might call innocent civilians, so to speak. And war is just ugly, and it's horrible. And as we're going to see later, when God talks about his promise to us, one of the things he promises to end is our constant warring. So the last words in One Day More last week were, tomorrow we'll discover what our God in heaven has in store. And then we just watched what was in store. James chapter 4, beginning of verse 13 says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow, we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. In Proverbs 19:21 says, many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. And there are, I just chose the two. There are many, many, many scriptures that talk about the schemes and the plans of man's mind and man's heart, and how foolish those can be. In particular, when you think you can govern your way and not take into account God's will there. So consider the plans of the main characters from last week's One Day More. The song in there. Jean Valjean in the song makes it clear that he intends to take Cosette and flee to England. That's what he sees. And when he talks about this one day, what's going to happen in the next day. Marius desires to be with Cosette, but ultimately chooses instead to join the revolution. Eponine intends to join the revolution, has accepted she will most likely die. Enjolras intends to lead the revolution to victory. And Inspector Javert intends to infiltrate the revolution and defeat it from the inside out. Most of these plans fail. When you weigh them in the end, everything that was sung about in One Day More, most of them fail on the next day. Instead of fleeing to England, Valjean is caught up in the conflict to protect the love interest of Cosette. Marius watches Eponine die as Eponine dies in his arms, and then later is himself wounded. The revelation fails, and Enjolras dies. Javert is discovered and captured, then later set free by his nemesis Valjean. Everything that we haven't gotten to what the Thénardiers had in their part of the song, and only Eponine, who had determined in advance to give her life and love, quote, succeeds in her One Day More plan. And I want to take a moment there just because as a matter of storytelling, in thinking about sacrifice and different forms of love and selflessness, and in watching in the song A Little Fall of Rain, I want to make a connection between Eponine and Marius and Fantine and Valjean. Valjean is at Fantine's side when she dies. And the arrangement between them is for Cosette's benefit. And whether directly or indirectly, there's a bit to infer about all of Eponine's intentions. Her intentions clearly are primarily for Marius's well-being. But Marius is there as Eponine dies, tries to calm her and give her peace, just as Valjean did for Fantine. And again, Cosette is the beneficiary of that sacrifice. So the building of the barricades and what it all wrought in the end, setting aside the social dynamics of what would follow and where it would lead for future revolution in France, and the history and the sociopolitics of all that in the lives of these individuals. This idea of having a sense of trying to control your own lives and running toward or running away, and whether or not we can really trust our own plans and really work hard to seek God's wisdom and God's plan and all that. Valjean is one who I think, because when he gets the letter, he comes around to that. He begins to see his larger role. A story arc that begins with his encounter with the bishop continues on here in his interactions, not only with Marius, but even with Inspector Javert as we go ahead. So that leads to me to the bigger part and something I was looking forward to in this study, and that is that, yeah, this is kind of a downer part of the whole story. And I make the argument that it reads in a lot of way like the Garden of Gethsemane. I'm not suggesting that the musical does that by intention. I would say there's already the seeds and the fertile soil there, just given the biblical religious content that's within the story that Victor Hugo wrote, that stays faithful through the musical. But much of what this happens in the basically from the night of anguish through the final battle has these kind of echoes and hints of the Garden of Gethsemane. So, and even reaching back into the final supper a little bit. Matthew 26, 36 through 56, long passage here, but I just want to read it and then dive into some of the things that happened in the story here. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away at once more, and he prayed a third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the man stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scripture be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have to come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted and fled. So interesting fact here. 3 characters disguise themselves in order to find themselves at the center of the action. Each of them also plays a role similar to the night of Jesus' betrayal. So Javert disguises himself, Eponine disguises herself, and then as Jean Valjean tries to get to the barricade, he disguises himself as a French soldier so he can make his way through the French lines. Inspector Javert is Judas. He pretends to be one of the revolutionaries and infiltrates their ranks. He lies to the revolutionaries, promising them intelligence from the front lines. And even one of the revolutionaries asks, "What are we going to do with this snake in the grass?" Little musical part here, and it makes sense, is kind of reflecting his deception, is that when he's first among them and they're asking about getting intelligence from the front lines, the melody lines he uses are the lines of the melody line of the students. So he sings like them until he's discovered. Then he reverts to "shoot me now or shoot me later," and reverts back to his "I am the law" way of singing. This was a stretch, but Eponine, Peter. During the final supper, Peter declares that he would die for Jesus. And like Peter, at the moment of the battle, in the conflict, in her story arc, she was impulsive and reacting on emotion, in particular her willingness to fight, similar to Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane. In fairness, there's a Christ-like quality in her as well, as she's willing to lay down her life to save Marius, who has rejected her love. And then Jean Valjean is the most obvious. He is a Christ figure in this, and it really comes out in the music as well as his actions. He's come to the barricades to rescue the life of a young man he hardly knows. He does so because of his love for his daughter, his adopted daughter, who he's also saved at great risk and at great cost. And now, so that she can know the love of this man, he's going to go risk his life to save him. In the midst of that, he shows mercy to his adversary when he releases Inspector Javert. And you can hear kind of this Christ-like forgiveness, grace, and mercy. You are free and there are no conditions, no bargains or petitions. There's nothing that I blame you for. You've done your duty, nothing more. And then similar to Jesus's, what I feel like are Jesus's, I just feel him as he's praying, if this cup could pass before me. He sings, and bring me home. If I die, let me die. Let him live. Bring him home. And so some of the songs here, and balancing, those are the three characters, but some of the songs and their words and how I feel like they reflect the Garden of Gethsemane. In the whole mix between Night of Anguish and Drink With Me, these are actually just lines from Drink With Me. Drink with me to days gone by. Can it be you fear to die? Will the world remember you when you fall? Could it be your death means nothing at all? Is your life just one more lie? And so this whole idea from the time of Eponine's death to the song of Drink With Me, that whole sense of dread that they're feeling right then. When they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter says, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Valjean's song. And I want to say this about Bring Him Home. Just, it's more of a fanboying thing as a side note. It is a fantastic song. And so if you want to Google and check out any of a dozen better versions of that song, it's just really, it takes a tenor to sing it. And I was going to say Jean Valjean, but that's how I'm trying to say the actor's name. Thank you. Hugh Jackman's not a tenor. He's a baritone. And then I know I shared at the very beginning of this, they didn't do these recordings in a studio, which you can always get a superior performance out of. So these were sung live. It was recorded just as he sang it, moving around the set, all of that. And so he does a serviceable job. I'm not being critical, just saying it's a beautifully written song. And if you want to go and listen to Colm Wilkinson sing it, or Alfred Bose singing it, or Romain Karamloo, I got hung up on his name, or any dozen people who've done it on Broadway or West End, you'll hear amazing versions of this song. It's one of 10 highlight moments in this whole show. And the words are a big part of it. God on high, hear my prayer. In my need, you have always been there. And then later he says, you can take, you can give, let him be, let him live. If I die, let me die, let him live, bring him home. Jesus, 3 times in the garden, says, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. So there's some reflections of that. I feel like in Jean Valjean's singing. He acknowledges God's authority. He says, you can take and you can give. So if it is your will, but if I die, let me die. Just let him be saved. Okay, then that's really the heart of Jesus too. You can take and you can give. You could let this cup pass before me, but not my will, but yours be done, so that these would be saved. And then for the final battle there, there is going back to warfare is a complicated thing, and without trying to make a black and white argument as to whether the students were wise or just, or if they had made a difference, just Jesus's words. This wasn't like Saving Private Ryan, but I felt they tried to capture some, without forgetting that we're in a musical, right? But they tried to capture some of the chaos and the horror of war. The moment in which the students are panicked, when all is lost, when people are falling, you can't figure out who has fallen and who hasn't. And there's smoke and there's shrapnel and there's debris flying everywhere, and just the horror of war. And Jesus's words at the time that his disciples sought to defend him, when he says, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. So, in this story, I like to think of this portion of, this is a Garden of Gethsemane moment. And I feel like, without necessarily, it's not a direct parallel, but we're just thinking about it in that sense. When we get to the last stretch of the story now, it's going to lead us to the last stretch, in a lot of ways, of the biblical story as well. And so that everything that is in despair right now, the war's lost, many people have died, many of them main characters, Eponine, and you think that's horrible, and you're trying to hold the tears back, and then Gavroche gets killed, and then you're like, forget it. Now I'm ruined.
Yeah.
And then Enjolras and all the comrades are dead, and Marius is wounded, and Valjean is trying to save him. And this is the night of Jesus' arrest. It's the dark, long night before, hopefully, the rescue. And that's what I have for tonight. We finish it next week.
We're just kind of like at the bottom of the barrel, so all we got is up.
Yeah.
There's
a
a
few characters like
there's a lot that happens next week. There's 3 or 4 important moments to unnoodle next week for sure.
It seemed like when I watched it, I've only watched it one other time, but you went through the war a lot faster than when you take it week by week.
You're like, we just spent a half an hour watching and it was all the war. Yeah.
So, it makes me think.
So have we watched the whole
barricade.
thing so far, or you skipped a little bit?
I haven't skipped anything. No.
This is the,
No,
mu-
wait.
this
Like
is the
slow.
musical version of it, though.
Well, it
There's
seems
the
like it's
other-
going pretty
there's
fast.
the other
I mean,
stage version.
159 minutes, that's
Yeah.
pretty long.
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it in theaters, and I was like, probably the one. It was one of like the first movies that were super long.
Like 3 hours. How old is it?
2012.
Well,
Oh,
Is it-
the musical
Maybe it's this one.
Right.
No,
was
between this one and The Hobbit, my dad left like 5 minutes before. He comes back because it's already like 2.5 hours, and then it's over. He's like, "Well, we're at 2.5 hours. I thought we had like at least a little bit longer." But we missed it.
in the days of the videotape. Bridget's famous for taking us Apollo 13 is just getting ready to go through dead space, and we run out of tape.
Illicit 159. I would have to look it up online. That's going to be your streaming. Well, it would list the same way in the theater, but that depends on however long credits are at the end as well. So I want it back to,
If you're staying for credits.
if you're staying for credit, well, if you're watching Marvel or Disney, what choice do you have?
Right.
You're waiting to see if there's some of the movie they haven't shown yet
Stay
to you.
after the credits.
Right. But just because we brought it up, I'm just curious. I'm going to look it up because I already have all the timestamps obviously figured out. So, I have, this ends at about 2.5 hours and 159 puts it at 2:40. So,
Credits.
yeah, good solid 9 minutes of credits there. Okay, well, let me, we're just right at 8 o'clock. So this seems like a good spot to stop. And I'll just, I'm going to close this with prayer and cut folks viewing online off or cut you loose, not cut you off. That's kind of rude, but cut you loose. And glad you're joining us and hope this has been an effective way to do this with you. And I look forward to next week wrapping it up with whoever can be here. So, Lord, as we've been going through this study, this is a moment, this part right here where, at least I know in my preparation, I was reminded that I had intentionally placed this in the season of Lent. And as we've been building toward the end of this story, these 2 weeks starting here, bring us into your passion, your salvation, your promises to us, your work of grace and mercy and rescue. And so I pray that through our time of reflecting on these things from the story, that it would remind us of the things that we are leading to in our own worship life, in our own walk with you as we move toward Easter as well. That it would be beyond simply something that's been an interesting, fun study of a musical, but that it's been a powerful tool that's been put together by an author and by a screenwriter, a playwright, and the music, and all these opportunities to bring us into your word and to think about it in a new and creative way that will perhaps make us see Easter with eyes and a heart and a mind that is able to see it a little bit differently and with a fresh sense. In Jesus' name, amen. You bet. Amen. Thank you for joining.
Tonight.
Thank you.
Maybe we could talk about how a lot of